An ad that was published in the Sumter Banner on March the 24th, 1847 said $50 reward. Ran away from the plantation of Robert English in Sumter District, South Carolina, about the 25th of December last, a Negro man named Jackson. Jackson is about 30 years of age, near 6 feet in height, stout and well-proportioned, has high and naked temples, speaks plausibly, has a wife in Houston County, Georgia, belonging to Mr. J.R. McLaw, whither he may have gone. The above reward will be paid for his delivery to the subscriber or for his lodgment in any jail so that I may get him again. In December of 1850, the wife of a faculty member in Brunswick, Maine, who had a modest sideline in magazine writing, hid a fugitive in her house. A friendly neighbor had sent the man over, and so it was that the little-known writer and harried mother opened her door. It was bitterly cold, and the house was crowded with children. Her husband was away, and yet she opened the door, a criminal act in 1850. The man stayed for only one night, but he made an impression upon the woman and her children, singing and entertaining them all and telling about his hardships. In a space apart from the children, no doubt he bared his back and showed her his scars from whippings he had received in a slave labor camp. We might imagine, he spoke too of his wife and child he had left behind. He was, she later wrote to her sister, a genuine article from the old Killarney state. Well, drawing from this experience some 7 weeks later, in 1851, Harriet Beecher Stowe began to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that helped inspire the most consequential social revolution in the history of the Western world, the overthrow of modern slavery. We're going to talk more about who that slave was on St. Louis in Tune. Welcome to St. Louis in Tune, and thank you for joining us for fresh perspectives on issues and events with experts, community leaders, and everyday people who make a difference in shaping our society and world. I'm Arnold Stricker, along with co-host Mark Langston. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be anywhere, if you've got to know. Yeah.
It is an interesting show we're going to have today.
Yeah.
When I first found out about this, I was like, whoa. Didn't know about that, and I've been around the block a couple times, and we live in a very historic area here in St. Louis,
right,
with a lot of wonderful history, Dred and Harriet Scott, et cetera, et cetera. But when I found out about this, I was like, I need to talk to the author of this book and really get some lowdown and give some good information to people that they probably don't even know about.
And this author was not easy to find. She's not even on this continent.
She's not on this continent. She's currently doing some research in the Netherlands. And before we do that, we're glad that you joined us today, folks. You can listen to previous shows at stlintune.com. Please help us continue to grow by leaving a review on our website, Apple Podcast, or your preferred podcast platform.
That's good.
Our return to civility today is, if you're having a disagreement over the phone and feel the urge to hang up, say so before you do. If your goal is to end the call, you can do it without slamming down the phone in a moment of mindless furor.
But I, in my younger years, when I was more of a loose cannon, and I would do that, I'd hang up and then I'd feel really bad about it. And then you can't call, if you don't know the person, let's say it's a customer service person, you can't call back and apologize. Yeah, don't do that to yourself or the person on the other end.
And the customer service people many times are the ones that catch the guff, but they're not the ones that really need to hear the fervor.
You're right, and I acknowledge that when I tell them, I'm very sorry, I'm frustrated, and that you have to take this. But
yeah.
It's a whole different thing when you talk, when you explain yourself that way.
We are keeping the line open on this phone because of our guest. Dr. Susanna Ashton is professor of English at Clemson University. She's also a scholar, storyteller, baker, gardener, reader, active political citizen, and family member. But her work has been profiled in the New York Times, CNN, and other media outlets across the country. She's authored, edited, or co-authored multiple titles on American literacy and cultural history, including Collaborators in Literary America, 1870 to 1920. I Belong in the South Carolina Slave Narratives, These Colored United States, African American Essays from the 1920s, The South Carolina Roots of African American Thought, and Approaches to Teaching, Charles W. Chestnut. In addition to these books, she has published in many scholarly journals as well as popular newspapers and public-facing digital media, where she's appeared in various media interviews and served as a featured expert in the documentary film Gina's Journey, The Search for William Grimes. I love this part. She's a faculty Fulbright scholar. In Ireland, she was a faculty fellow at Yale University's another favorite, Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, a Mark Twain Fellow for the Mark Twain Society, W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow at the Hutchins Center for African American Research at Harvard University.
Hold it, he's on page 2 now. Okay.
Yes, I'm on page 2 right now. And she works as an expert on contested authorship of slavery or freedom narratives.
Wow.
Dr. Ashton, welcome to St. Louis in Tune.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Wow.
So what sparked your interest in slave narratives?
20 or so years ago, I got my first job, which there are not a lot of jobs in academia, so I was thrilled. And I landed in South Carolina at Clemson University, which is a big public university. People know it as a football powerhouse, which it sure is, but it's an amazing place in many other ways as well. And it happens to be located on a plantation labor camp. Indeed, the plantation house is in the center of campus.
Wow.
And nobody, it's not that they were hiding it. It was just, I think, particularly my students were so polite. No one wants to say the wrong thing. Everyone's very careful and a little shy about talking about it. And nobody could really talk easily about the fact that we were on we're at a university that was on a plantation site, which, frankly, I think is the best possible scenario. If you're on a place that has a dark history,
right,
let's put public education that brings everybody in and lifts everybody up. I think it's the best possible scenario. But anyways, I started working with students, trying to understand that a little bit better, and often teaching is where the best research starts. And my students and I said, let's look at people from South Carolina, like survivors. I'm really interested in witness testimony. Let's look at how survivors explained what it was like. And that's where I started looking at little-known or unpublished. I didn't discover these, but they're little-known narratives, working with them, editing them, publishing them. And one of them I stumbled across was by this man named John Andrew Jackson, who had survived slavery in South Carolina, had escaped from bondage, and had lived to write his story. But he wrote it in England, and so it never really got distributed in America. It never really, for all sorts of reasons I go into in my book, it never got very well known in America, and yet it was this crazy story. So that's sort of how I began with all my work on narratives by formerly enslaved people, and particularly with John Andrew Jackson.
And we're talking with you about the book. It's called A Plausible Man, the true story of the escaped slave who inspired Uncle Tom's Cavern. And this is unlike any other book that I've read, because his narrative was different than many other narratives that were going on. And you mentioned it was really published in England. The other ones were in the States here. What was so odd about or different about his narrative from other slave narratives that have been published at that time?
One thing that made it stand out was, and can I say this, it was a little bit funny. He had an edge to him. He had a little bit of sarcasm. He had a little bit of he was a talker, and he was a writer, and he had a personality, and it really came out. At one point, he was trying to escape through the city of Charleston, and he was trying to get on a boat, getting onto a boat so that he could smuggle himself out of South Carolina. And so he's just trying to figure things out and wandering around the docks. And some people come to him and they say, "Who do you belong to?" And he answers, I belong to South Carolina, which that is nonsensical. In that context, it was just something he just get out of my face type of answer. But and it worked, the people walked away. So they're like, what? That didn't make any sense. What? But they walked away, so that's fine. But later he wrote about this and he said, it was none of their business who I belonged to. I was trying to belong to myself. You really get a sense of he has a lot of little asides, a lot of little comments, and I was like, and a sense of humor about the horror, which is hard to have. And so his personality really jumped out.
He had a little swag to him.
Oh,
say so.
Who was John Andrew Jackson? Let's let the listeners know a little bit about.
Okay, and first off, hey folks, If you haven't heard of him, that's fine. Most people haven't. You have now. I hadn't heard of him. He has completely been disappeared from history, except in particular situation I can explain in a minute. But yeah, so John Andrew Jackson was born in Sumter County, South Carolina, probably around 1820, don't know exactly. And he was taught to be a machine for making money. He was taught to have a life that would endure great suffering and would be picking cotton and taking care of horses and animals and doing labor around a farm, around a plantation site to enrich the people who enslaved him. He tried to do the best he could to find love and family and community, but it was very difficult. He fell in love with a girl at a neighboring site named Louisa, and they got married as much as they were allowed to get married, which is not at all, but in their minds they were married. And a little girl, little Ginny he refers to, and he sneaks out at night to go visit her, and they try to build a life the best they can. But then a couple of years later, the enslavers of Louisa and little Jenny decide to send them both away to Georgia. And Jackson's devastated. Pretty confident he'll never see them again. He'll never be reunited, and he has nothing left to lose. So he decides to run away. And that's really where the story really begins. He manages to get to the city of Charleston. He manages, through lots of drama, to get aboard a boat. He smuggles himself between bales of cotton, and he lands in Massachusetts. But that sounds really easy, and it sounds like his story would be over. But in a way, the story was in some ways just beginning because he wasn't really safe in Massachusetts. I'll fast forward a little bit, but he tries to raise money for his family to free them, and he's getting some money. It's complicated. He's making some inroads. But before he can really get enough money for Louisa and little Ginny, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act passes. And that basically means he could be, the free states are no longer really free states. There's no safety for fugitives. Now that's required that they go back, and all the officials are under extra legislation that requires them to assist in the recapture of fugitives. So he's been very prominent. He's not been quiet and hiding his name and hiding or anything. He's been out there talking about his experiences trying to raise money. So he's a known entity. So this time he escapes to Canada. And this time he's assisted by the Underground Railroad, which was just really getting organized around then. And it was a lot less organized than people think. And his first escape he did all on his own. But this one he had people helping him a little bit from house to house, giving him money here and there. And he makes his way up to Maine, right? There's no railroad into Canada. It's not easy, and it's wintertime. And he goes through the town of Brunswick, Maine, which is a little college town then and now. And that's where he has a encounter with Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, I think Jackson's life is rich and wild and complicated and goes on into the 20th century. He spends the rest of his life trying to save people and to maybe stitch our nation back together. But this little incident with Stowe is, of course, a very marvelous and exciting hook for how his life unfolds. So that's some of the big picture.
As I was reading the book, and folks, the book is a great read because Dr. Ashton goes through what you've just heard in way more detail and really explains his character. And if I would,
right.
It seems like his character changes a little bit. He's quite a salesman. He's what I would call a stump speaker, and then in his last days gets a little desperate. And would you agree with that, or?
Let's start with, I think, calling him a little bit of a hustler. I think that word is fair. I think he had to be to survive. He's a talker. Right. He will talk his way out of problems. He often talks his way into problems. Everybody who likes him or dislikes him says, oh, my gosh, he's a talker. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, when he visited her and the children, he says, oh, she entertained my children. He entertained my children. They loved listening to him talk and sing. And that you also read out loud that advertisement where his enslaver points out he talks plausibly. He may talk his way out of a situation. He may give you information, but don't believe it, right? Whether you liked him or disliked him, everybody comments on how he could talk his way in and out of problems. And then he becomes a public speaker. Absolutely. That's a big part of his character. But later on, he's not afraid to talk back. And even well after the Civil War is over and there's emancipation and he comes back to America after having been abroad in Canada and England for a couple of years, he talks back. He's overconfident and he doesn't quite recognize the problems. And indeed, he gets into fights with officers and people like that, white officers, for talking back, even in the Reconstruction era, and gets thrown off trains and gets in fights and is eventually arrested and even put on a chain gang.
Oh my.
Probably really under false charges, but just because he had a big mouth about what he was doing and who he was. Well, yeah, that was his character, but he never gave up. He was just tired. He was a very old man. I have records of him going around collecting money, trying to give them to the freed people in South Carolina. And he wasn't, for the most part, he wasn't embezzling. As far as I can tell, he may have taken some to line his pocket and to survive, but I do have actual receipts for donations that he helped coordinate so that I know they actually reached the people he wanted them to reach, which is beautiful to think of.
Yeah, he was
so
helping.
far away from time. I can prove that he did donate stuff.
Wow.
It was the Freedmen's Bureau he was working with or for after the war, and it seemed, as I was reading the book, as he was running into dead ends, then he would change his course a little bit or change exactly what he was raising money for. First it was, to get his wife and child out, then it was to get his other immediate family, and then it was to, now I'm going to, help the people down in South Carolina. Now I'm going to build a school. Now I'm going to build a church. And I don't want to use the word opportunist, or I know you use the word hustler, but he was trying to just, I guess, fulfill a dream and some urge in himself to make a difference from where he came from.
And again, I think some of those were maybe situations change. He later says he believes his wife and child have died. Mm-hmm. So he starts raising money to free his elderly father and the children of his sister who had been murdered under slavery. These are legitimate sort of changes in his thing. But yeah, he is, when you look at so I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So he encounters Harriet Beecher Stowe in Maine, and then spends a night with her, and in his memoir he talks about this meeting, and then he goes to Canada, where he's there for a while and remarries another fugitive slave, and then they go to England, where he becomes a lecturer, and there he gets involved with a whole other exciting sort of celebrity. Right. Other than Harriet Beecher Stowe, he gets involved with Charles Spurgeon, the great Baptist preacher, who is a beloved, charismatic figure in Baptist history. And so Spurgeon becomes his patron, really.
Right.
And Jackson is sort of a protege for a while, and everything's going great, and then that relationship falls apart. And so Jackson sees a lot of ups and downs, and then he races back to America and spends many years raising money, going back and forth between New England and the South, trying to bring the country together. So, yeah, that's the big picture of Jackson. But about the change in personalities and hustles, I don't think it's a change in personality. I think it's just he pivots when he needs to, and some of his projects fail. He tries to raise money to buy his enslavers' land. Do you remember that part? That's crazy.
That is crazy.
That.
But
I know. There's plenty of bankrupt people in the South. He could have bought land from anybody. But he's, no, I want that chunk of land.
And I get that. Yeah. That makes perfect sense to me, because it's a pride thing. It's, hey, I'm a man. I can do this. Mm-hmm. I can own land and become productive and be a part of what this country is about. Mm-hmm.
Sure. And not only that, he dreamed of putting other families there, too. He was like, let's get 40 black families here, and we'll live as a community and be safe, and we can look out for each other. And, like most of his ideas, it didn't happen. He didn't get the money together. But the audacity of even trying is crazy.
And to think about it, he was really, and I think about this in this way, he was ahead of his time in where he wanted the country to be and where he wanted other people to be. And maybe that's why he had that audacity. And I was really surprised in reading the book that what I would call the circuit speakers, or the speakers, there were so many that went around and talked about slavery in the States and how they needed people to validate their quest for getting help. He had a letter from Harriet Beecher Stowe, or had, I guess, some support from her verbally, from Charles Spurgeon, and then General Howard. You know, the importance of that, I guess I had really not realized. That gave somebody validation to stand up and speak to other people back in England and also in the New England area.
Well, and I think it's important because it wasn't just, oh, he's black and is not trustworthy, which might have been a little of how audiences were a little worried about it, right? They didn't consider black people as necessarily honest as white people. But I think also as the pre-internet era, it was very easy to run into scammers and con men, right? You couldn't fact-check people on the internet. Now if somebody comes and makes a claim, you can think they're fake on the internet. We all know that. But at least you have a better shot at tracking down someone's identity and verifying their story. And that didn't exist in the 19th century. So when he goes to England in 1856 and he invents himself as a lecturer, and I love that you notice the detail. He had everybody, a number of ministers at various churches say things either to newspapers or in letters. They say, I saw he had a document from Harriet Beecher Stowe endorsing him. And that letter has since disappeared, but we know it existed. So we know Harriet Beecher Stowe did not disavow that she had met Jackson. She believed him. She endorsed his story. And so that opened a lot of doors for him. But yeah, I think at that time you needed, if you're going to get up at a church or in a town hall and talk about slavery in America, and you're in England, you got to have a local minister has to introduce you. You have to have all these endorsements, maybe from fancy people who you can read out loud their letters, things like that, to say, and now we welcome John Andrew Jackson to the stage.
And we are actually talking to Dr. Susanna Ashton. She's an author of the book we're talking about, A Plausible Man, The True Story of the Escaped Slave Who Inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin. I was looking at one of the wonderful spots on the internet. I'm looking at Mark and getting ready to smile, on Wikipedia, on Harriet Beecher Stowe's Wikipedia page. Maybe it's Uncle Tom's Cabin Wikipedia page.
Okay.
And she wrote a book about the truth behind Uncle Tom's Cabin, about who the people were.
Right.
Now,
right.
John Andrew Jackson is not mentioned there, so that Wikipedia site has to be updated, folks, if you want to check that out.
You can do that.
You can do that.
It's complicated. It is complicated. Well, I want to be careful here because I'm actually from English. I'm not a historian by training. I do historical work, but I'm really interested in stories and how we tell our stories and where our stories come from. And you'll notice in the title of my book, I don't say that he's a model for Uncle Tom or a model for any character, because we could say he is. But what I'm interested in is she was just a little magazine writer. And she was an intellectual, and she had family who were very famous ministers and who were involved in anti-slavery stuff. She certainly was an abolitionist, but she wasn't an activist, right? That's different. Mm-hmm. And so she went from sort of theory to practice when she opened her door to this fugitive who knocked on her door in Maine. And she brought him inside. She fed him. She gave him a place to sleep. She let her children chatter with him. The next morning, she gave him some clothes and money and sent him off on his way to Bath, another little town in Maine, where he might be able to get some help there. And so she may not even have known his name at that time, which is interesting. But she, 6 weeks later or 5 weeks later, just a few weeks later, she was sitting in church and suddenly had this revelation from God, as she described. And she was struck by the fact that she had a vision that she could write a story, a book about slavery and family separations and the obscenity of the injustice that human bondage represented. And so she started writing this book. And so what I'm really interested in is how this encounter with Jackson inspired her to start writing, inspired her to activism, what that moment was. And Jackson wasn't the only thing. There were other experiences she had, other things she read about that informed what she did. But that encounter was really pivotal in making it personal, bringing it into her kitchen, which it never had before in that way. So that's sort of part of my argument. Also, The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin is a weird book. So she wrote this spectacular Uncle Tom's Cabin. They had to invent a new kind of printing press to handle how many books needed to be printed of that. Does that keep... I love that detail. Uncle Tom's Cabin was crazy popular. Like, it was best-selling doesn't even begin to describe success of
the
that book.
Best-selling novel, second only to, in literary works, to the Bible.
No kidding.
During that
Yes,
time.
the King James Bible in the 19th century. That's absolutely right. It's just everywhere. Everywhere. And even people who had never read it all heard of it and knew the characters, and there were plays and songs, and it was just like a total common cultural reference.
Who knew?
That everybody would know about. Anyway, so she wrote this incredibly important book, but a lot of, and it was really effective, right? And when something's effective, there's a backlash. So you started getting all these Southern writers saying, she's exaggerating, things aren't that bad, she doesn't know what she's talking about, she's just a little New Englander who's really ignorant, things like that. So she decided to write something called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which, it's a weird book. It's got like court cases that she's citing, and she doesn't say that this is exactly this or I drew on this. It's more that she's saying, I talk about evil and pain, and here is a person who talked about evil and pain, or here's a newspaper article about laws about something terrible in the treatment of black people. And then she does list people who she found useful, and she lists a couple of them who she said, someone's so-and-so's narrative was very helpful to me. She mentions a guy named Henson, who she says, my stories are parallel to some of his life. I think it's the phrase she uses. Anyway, so she's acknowledging other things, but what's interesting is she's careful. She doesn't say, I read all these before I wrote my book. She often says, I read some of them after, or we know she didn't buy those books or read them until after she'd started writing. So the whole Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin is a very weird and messy sort of source. Now, and she doesn't mention Jackson in it, but again, we know later on Jackson was in Canada, decided to go to England, and by that point she was famous. And he clearly contacted her in some way and got her to write a letter of endorsement for him, which she did, and which he carried with him to England.
We're talking to Susanna Ashton. She is professor of English at Clemson University and the author of A Plausible Man, the true story of the escaped slave who inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin. We'll be right back to talk more to her about that. This is Arnold Stricker of St. Louis In Tune on behalf of the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision was a major legal event and catalyst that contributed to the Civil War. The decision declared that Dred Scott could not be free because he was not a citizen. The 14th Amendment, also called the Dred Scott Amendment, granted citizenship to all born or naturalized here in our country and was intended to overturn the U.S. Supreme Court decision on July 9, 1868. The Dred Scott Heritage Foundation is requesting a commemorative stamp to be issued from the U.S. Postal Service to recognize and remember the heritage of this amendment by issuing a stamp with the likeness of the man Dred Scott. But we need your support and the support of thousands of people who would like to see this happen. To achieve this goal, we ask you to download, sign, and share the one-page petition with others. To find the petition, please go to dredscottlives.org and click on the Dred Scott Petition Drive on the right side of the page. On behalf of the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation, this has been Arnold Stricker of St. Louis In Tune. Welcome back to St. Louis In Tune. This is Arnold Stricker with Mark Langston. We're talking to Dr. Susanna Ashton about her book, A Plausible Man, the true story of the escaped slave who inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin. And just listeners, so you know, we're not strictly about St. Louis kinds of things, although all of these things we talk about that are not related to St. Louis impact those of us who live here in one way or another. It educates us about what's happening in the greater region, in our country, and internationally. And that's why we're having her on to talk about this. I don't know how many people actually knew that John Andrew Jackson ever existed.
Right.
Number two, that he went to Harriet Beecher Stowe's house one night and spent the night there, which was totally unheard of, and as an escaped slave. And then three, that he was an inspiration behind Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's always interesting to know what are the facts behind that. And Dr. Ashton, I wanted to tell you that I know you say you're just a professor of English and not a historian, but you have done your homework. You have all of your references listed. I read through at the end on the epilogue all the people you thanked and all the people that you had from the history department. Check out your research. And that is really critical because a lot of people will just put it down and throw it out there and publish it. But you have done your work on this. And I think that is one reason that actually the folks at Harriet Beecher Stowe's house really, they have on their website that this is, and it was the inspiration for her. They've said that. At least that's what I recall reading.
Yeah.
So that's kudos to you for that.
Yeah, part of. Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, if I could say, one of the lessons in the book has nothing to do with Harriet Beecher Stowe, but one of the messages sort of I was hoping to convey is I want to embolden readers. We live in a marvelous time in some ways in terms of finding stories and family stories and finding out about our history. Things are digitized and searchable and accessible in ways that they never were before. And I don't mean generations, like even 10 years, 5 years ago, you couldn't do things that you can do now. And so one thing I tried to do in my book is each chapter is focused around a document, a receipt,
yes,
a court case, a census page, a letter, a memoir. There's some sort of document, an advertisement. And I want people to walk there like, you can read these. How do you deal with reading these? How do we learn to read a census page for the story? Because these are all imperfect, messy documents, but they tell us just incredible things. And I really wanted to walk people through it so they feel like you too can. It used to be this kind of research was only for fancy scholars and rare book libraries, but now like anybody with an internet connection can look up old census data and city directories and put things together. So I wanted to encourage that.
Well, I think you really did, and this wasn't a couple-year project. I think I was reading, this is like an 8 to 10 year project that you were working on.
Oh,
and did you take
more than that, my friend?
To write the book?
Yeah. Did you take time off from Clemson? Did they give you some sabbatical time to work on this?
Yeah, Clemson was very supportive, and you saw I had fellowships at Yale and Harvard that supported my work for semesters at a time. I'll also say, because I had 3 small children, and it was COVID happened, and I had 3 kids homeschooling in my house for a year and a half, and I was trying to run a department life, but I think it's okay. I'm not actually complaining about that. I think life unfolds, and you just keep plugging away at things. And Jackson just stayed with me until I was able to finish the project. So,
did you have llamas to take care of at that time, too?
I'm sorry?
Did you have llamas to take care of at that time, too?
Llamas.
I wish. Oh, yes. During COVID, I managed to sneak out to a farm that had llamas to try to take something we could do outdoors that was safe. And I took all my kids to go look at llamas. And I have a wonderful picture of all the llamas on my webpage. Yeah.
I saw that. I didn't know if you were raising llamas or had llamas there or something.
Oh, I wish. Shouldn't we all just retire and raise llamas? That would be a life.
Oh, my gosh.
Listeners, her website is SusannaAshton.com, SusannaAshton.com, SusannaAshton.com.
/llamas.
Yes, /llamas. You were mentioning about each chapter starts with a document. Give an example. And when you were talking about that, the one that came to mind to me was the census in Canada that identified
that's crazy.
A group of people as from the United States, basically. But that was not all the story. But you pick one.
Oh, no, thank you. I love it because this reminds you that every document and census, all the census data is different. I looked at census data from Canada where they asked how much maple syrup people produce per year. You learn a lot about the story of a locality. But this particular census of 1851 in Canada, and it had this little appendix page where, to begin with, why does the census have an appendix page is a little weird, but it was just throwing in the name of a cluster of people who were black, and instead of listing them as, it had a section where you're supposed to list people by race. And this is the 19th century. They're black, white, they'll use all sorts of ugly words we don't use now, but they list people by race, even in Canada. And yet, instead of listing them it listed them as black, And then it listed them as United States. It listed them, instead of a racial identity, it gave them a national identity, which is really weird, right?
I thought so, yeah.
I looked at that, and what you think was, I try to think of what I called guerrilla inscription. Somebody decided they wanted to help the fugitives. They didn't want to say, these are fugitives from the law in the United States.
Right.
Instead, they wrote something a little weird, a little ambiguous, so these people could slip through without too many problems. And it reminds you that they were fugitives from the law. They were fugitives from bondage, but they were also criminals of, and I'm very careful as I say this, take a deep breath, self-theft. Right? That was their crime. And that was an actual thing. And in Canada, which was supposed to be sending people back, and they didn't, usually. But so that census was crazy, and it listed Jackson's name, and it suddenly told me about the little community he was with and the people he was traveling with. But it also told me that something very special had happened with that census taker in Canada in 1851, who had decided to, I think he decided to see people as people for who they were,
right,
instead of just being bureaucratic. He decided to really look at the suffering in front of him and do something a little bit careful, and a little bit thoughtful.
And it could have been, as you were stating, the other way around, and the fact that there were other individuals who were probably running at the time and fleeing to Canada because there was some quote-unquote little freedom there.
Yeah.
But then even in England, where he found a community of black citizens where he could be comfortable with, my words, and not be afraid of, because there was still some issues over there at the time. It wasn't all fun and games because they had abolished slavery earlier in the century. But it was, I was just really taken by how he sought out, and which just tells me he was a very determined man. He was very smart about what he did, where he wanted to be. He worked hard. If he needed money, he would go work. He would talk in the wintertime and work in the summertime. He was a whitewasher, a painter. He worked in a foundry, a lot of different things like that. And one of the things I thought was very interesting that you talked about was his literacy. And how did he write his own particular, what I'm going to call memoir, or his story, and without really any training? And then there's a recent info that I think you can talk about related to that.
Oh, yes. Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question, because his literacy is just fascinating. To begin with, let me just have a moment for you and for your listeners. Learning to read and write as an adult is just one of the hardest things to do. Children learn like magic, right? But for adults, learning to be literate is just a spectacular achievement. And I'm not totally clear about every detail how he learned to read. I have some theories, and I have letters he wrote and documents he signed in later life. So he was definitely functionally literate. But literacy is a spectrum, right? It's not just, yes, you're literate, or no, you're not. I think he was functionally literate. I think he was able to write letters. I think he was able to sign things. I don't think he was very polished. So the written work, like the book that he wrote in England, it says written by John Andrew Jackson, authored by John Andrew Jackson. It doesn't say there was an editor. It doesn't say as told to. And yet, I bet you somebody edited it. I bet there was a church he was working with who was helping him do things, and I think they probably edited it pretty heavily. On the other hand, later on, he got mad at the leader of that church. He got mad at Charles Spurgeon. He felt Spurgeon had betrayed him. And so he wrote a little pamphlet about how angry he was at Spurgeon. And this pamphlet is a mess. This pamphlet's he's throwing, I don't like Spurgeon. He stole money that was supposed to be raised on my behalf. And I think he has alcohol in the basement. I mean, he's like throwing everything he can at Spurgeon. And it's a little incoherent. It's really badly written. It's out of order. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And yet it seems really genuine because of that. That's how people who are not good writers write. So the way that's oddly a little bit more of his literacy. I think I have one theory I wrote about in the book, and then I have a little twist on it that I've since discovered. In the book, I say, look, I just don't know how he learned to read he couldn't have learned as a young person. But I think maybe he got a little bit of education in Canada. I don't have really evidence. I'm just guessing on that. But maybe his second wife might have been literate. Maybe somebody tutored him a little bit. Maybe he learned a little bit in Canada. And then he went to England, and I believe he may have continued to try to learn. I know he was trying to attend Sunday schools in England, and he wanted books. So he clearly wanted books at that point, so he was literate enough to want books. And so that's how I suspect in the book I talk about it. What I've discovered since the book came out is while in South Carolina in the 1820s and 1830s, there were many laws forbidding people to teach slaves from reading, many laws. Nonetheless, sometimes people did, and it seems that the particular church where Jackson's enslavers were right near a Black River Church, Presbyterian Church, which has records about teaching slaves to read. And I know that Jackson and his family went there. And I know that Jackson's family and his enslavers also went there. So it is possible that Jackson had some low level of literacy that began actually in that church in South Carolina, because there are documents attesting to the fact that they decided they wanted to teach slaves to read the Bible. They didn't want them to be free. They didn't want them to forge passes to get themselves freedom or read maps or do anything like that, but they wanted them to be able to read the Bible. And so although it wasn't really officially sanctioned, this particular church community did do that in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s. So it is very possible Jackson got some level of education starting there, at least.
You have
which is just crazy.
It is crazy.
It's a wild story.
He is a man who just wouldn't let go of something. He never would like if a door closed, he would find another way through. I was surprised at the fervency at which he responded to Charles Spurgeon and then really pushed General Howard, too, that things weren't going his way. And he was almost in what I would call a little pest to General Howard a little bit and pushing the envelope.
Yeah, General Howard, who was head of the Freedmen's Bureau, and had known Jackson at some point, perhaps through their connections in Maine. And we have letters that Jackson kept writing, "You know me, please don't forget me, really, you know me," because Howard was quite elderly and may have refused to see him or something. Yeah, Jackson was not, he would not give up. He would solicit people and then solicit them again. But he did make a difference. One of the other points I'd love to share with your audience in the book is that early on in the process of writing this book, I tried to figure out why he was called Jackson. And was that a first name or a last name? And I couldn't figure it out for sure. And I decided to look into his family tree, and I couldn't find any surviving members that seemed connected to that. I couldn't find his family tree. I couldn't figure it out with genealogy. And then I finally realized, in the very beginning of the book, he mentions his father, who he was called Dr. Clavern. And he was enslaved, but he had learned, this man had learned the African method of curing snake bite, says Jackson. And as a result was considered like a healer in the community, not just for his local plantation site, but for other labor camps around there. And so his father was really important, and Jackson talks about his father, and I later find out that this is delightful, that Dr. Clavern lived in long enough to be free and to register to vote, which I think is terrific. I found a voting registration for Dr. Clavern.
Wow.
But anyway, that name, Doctor, became a first name in a family of that era called Clavon. And every generation they had one or two people named Clavon. And so that's how I managed to meet many members of the Clavon family, who are Jackson's family descendants, and including one gentleman who is terrific, and he has a PhD, and he's in the Army, and his name is Dr. Clavon today. Yeah, I know. Isn't that fantastic?
Go figure.
He thinks he was, everyone thinks they were named after their uncle or their grandfather, and that's all true. It's all honoring an immediate relative. But if you go way back, the original Dr. Clavern was someone very special and a real leader in his community. And I just love that's how I was able to finally track Jackson down. And again, that's something we can do now with genealogy sites and library access and scanned newspapers. Any of your readers, you can go out there. You can do this now. Get a librarian to help you and get started.
And get started, you could actually, if you're going to be in Florida or you're going to be at the University of Michigan, or you're going to be, where's this one at? It's in Minnesota. If you're going to be in Ohio, Dr. Ashton is going to be speaking in a variety of things this spring. Are your talks all going to be about?
I'd call it storytelling.
And she would too.
I think
she would
Dr.
too.
Ashton is. I know. I'm just like enthralled with what I'm just like. I don't want to stop her. I mean it. It's wonderful. It really is. I like a story better than being told and preached to and that kind of thing.
And that's what's neat about the book, Mark. Is it's just not a history book. It's told in a story form, and everybody likes stories.
Mm-hmm. Who knew about all of this? I didn't know who inspired Uncle Tom's
Cabin. That's why we're talking to Dr. Ashton.
Never, ever knew.
So what are your conversations going to be about when you do all of these speaking events?
One, I love talking to people about the story, and then, as I said, I like to end with talking about it can empower other people to learn things, sometimes in ways that are unexpected. Right now, there are a lot of people who are really frightened of painful history. It's a political climate. It's hard to talk about. It's upsetting. People don't want to mislead people. People want to look at the sunny side of everything. Okay, I do actually understand that impulse, but primary source documents don't lie, and that you can decide for yourself. What I'm working on right now, actually, working on this week, is I'm trying to write a young adults version of A Plausible Man for younger readers, not children, but like high school students. Mm-hmm. And my goal with that book is to allow students to say, look, you look at a census record, go look up an arrest record, go look up tax records where people reported slaves as property. And that's just there. You tell me what you think about it, but you make up your own mind. But let's look at primary sources from our history and the stories it can tell, and we'll all be richer for it.
That's a wonderful comment. That's a wonderful encouragement to people, whether they're young or old, to find out what those primary sources are and dig a little deeper and get the true story about what's going on.
I don't want this to be an unfair question, but what was the inspiration for you to even take on this kind of a subject and go this way? I'm going to tell you it's very needed, and knowing the history of where all of this started, we're talking a man that lived over 200 years ago, I would think. Is that, if my math is right? For you to just say, this is an interesting part in our history. This is someone we need to know about. And I'm so interested in him because he would find a project or something that he thought was really important. Instead of doing one labor job or whatever, he bounced around. He saw a project, something that needed to be tended to, and he would focus and put all of his efforts to it, from what I can see. So this is
right, and they didn't always work. They usually didn't work, honestly. But I like at his very end of his life, I know he took donated money and he bought some land in South Carolina to build his church or his school or something. It didn't work out. But you know what? I have a record of him sending the property deed back to Massachusetts so that the people who donated would know that they now had the control of the land and that he hadn't absconded it or embezzled it or stolen their money. He did things like that. So I know he wasn't totally full of it.
He wasn't a scoundrel.
He wasn't taking donations for orphanages. Yeah, again, maybe he was a little bit, lined his pockets a little bit for survival, but most of the time he seems to have been just absolutely earnest about what he was doing and about trying to help. And what's also fascinating about his story, too, is he lived a long time, folks. He was around probably 1820 to probably like 1900, 1901, maybe 1902. And we see, of course, he talked about his life under slavery. But then there's another 40 years of his life where he's involved and engaged in traveling around the country. And then I said, I'm getting arrested. And did we mention he got put on a chain gang and escaped? So the next 40 years, it really tells us about American history of that era in a very different way, too.
That's a whole nother show right there.
Oh, yeah.
Talking about the election of 1878 and the downfall there. Wow.
Yeah.
I am so glad, number one, that you wrote this book, and then number two, that we're able to talk to you about this. And I really encourage everyone to get the book. It's A Plausible Man, the true story of the escaped slave who inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin by Susanna Ashton. You can check out her website at susannaashton.com. She is a professor of English at Clemson University.
Can you buy the book on the website?
You can, yeah, there are a number of links, both to bookshop.org and Amazon and the press itself. So
Okay.
go for it, people.
All right.
Also, shout out to the fact that there is a fantastic voice actor who read my book for Audible, and it blew me away. He's really good. So if you're an Audible book person,
Yep.
that's a great option too.
That's a growing industry right there.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It really is, yeah.
Dr. Ashton, thank you very much for taking time to talk to us today. I really greatly appreciate it.
Yep. That was fun. Very fun. You
Thanks so much. It was fun too.
come
We'll
back
be in
soon.
touch. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Doctor.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. I don't think she was finished.
It was, Mark, I'm just amazed at how many things, I don't want to say this in a bad way, how many things we don't know.
Oh, yeah.
But everybody knows about Uncle Tom's Cabin. And when I saw this, I was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I had no idea. I had none.
And
Not till today's show.
Did she just draw on her, I'm talking about Harriet Beecher Stowe now, did she just draw on what she saw or maybe some things she read in the newspaper?
Right.
And the fact that she had Uncle Tom's Cabin in a newspaper that was published that went on, it was like a series that she did, and then it was finally published in the book. It wasn't initially published in the book, it was published in the newspaper.
Wow.
And that's how she gained that reputation. And she sold the rights to that. She didn't get a whole lot of money at all for the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was really the book she wrote that was on dread that she actually made some money.
Okay.
And the fact that her husband was a professor and she was just doing her thing at home and had an audience that she wrote for in some anti-slavery newspapers. And
I'd love to spend some time talking about Dred Scott with her. I think that'd be great.
yeah, and it was on Dred it wasn't Dred Scott, it was Dred who was a slave.
Oh,
and was a companion story to Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, now we've had Dred and Harriet Scott's great-granddaughter on
Right.
the show before.
Right.
And we need to have her back because
should.
the old courthouse is going to be reopening in May, and they're going to have a whole big display on Dred and Harriet Scott and the
Right.
fact that they can't get a stamp, but gee, we can get a stamp for Betty White. Seriously?
I know. It's crazy.
What's going on?
Why?
Why?
Why can't you do both?
How hard is that?
Yeah. Really, how it apparently very hard.
Yes, I
because
guess so.
we've been trying to help for years now and got nowhere.
So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, she's really something. She really is.
So you need to check out her website, folks. She also has a whole lot of other interesting information about other people who she's done some work on. James Matthews, William Grimes, Samuel Williams. Check her website out, susannaashton.com, susannaashton.com.
And she likes llamas.
Yeah, she likes llamas. I thought she raised llamas there for a minute there by the picture.
I
thought,
know.
well, there's the family around with the llamas. Huh? They weren't feeding them, though. So our word of the day, Mark.
I've been waiting. We've got time. Not a lot of time, but time.
Decorticate.
Oh, decorticate.
Decorticate. It's to remove the bark or husk or an outer covering from something. In other words, the farmer bought a machine that quickly decorticates cottonseed, or the botany students learn how to decorticate a tree without damaging layers below the bark.
I'll be darned.
It's also a word that has something to do with if you have a brain injury, too. Decorticate
Really?
is how you look, where your limbs will turn in, your hands will turn in or turn out, depending. I think decorticates turn in. So that wasn't the definition that I got initially, but that is also decorticate.
Wow.
A meaning for that.
That's quite a word.
It is.
That is quite a word.
It is.
I know.
You have some days of the day?
Just a couple. We only have a time for a few. National Chili Day. I'm going to go home and ask that we have some chili today. I like chili. I've been wanting chili.
Do you do a chicken chili, or do you do beef chili, or
There's so many.
chili?
I know, and I like a chili cook-offs where you can go and try different
Yes.
people's chilies.
Yes.
And there's even who makes chili without beans, but some people do, and it's really great. And speaking of eating, Fat Thursday is today. I'll tell you that right now.
Is that right today?
Today's Fat Thursday.
I had forgotten about that.
Yeah, that's where you just need to eat a lot of chili.
Yeah.
Because Ash Wednesday is coming right up.
That's correct.
And 40 days of fasting something. I don't know what.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a joke or two here. And yet another time this morning, no one was standing next to my bed saying, Your Royal Highness, here is your mimosa. Here's some marriage advice. Husbands, if your wife does something wrong, just explain to her how your mom did it. She will appreciate your advice and strive to do it as she did. Wow. Don't do that, guys. Don't do that.
Holy smokes.
And having a dog named Shark at the beach was a mistake. Shark! Get back here. Shark. Wow. Okay, and I think I have one more.
Oh, thank goodness. Okay.
To my children, don't make fun of me for asking questions about my cell phone. I once taught you how to use a spoon.
Wow, that's so true.
Okay.
Wow, thanks, Doc.
That's all for this hour, and we thank you for listening, folks. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can listen to additional shows at stlintune.com. Consider leaving a review on our website, Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or your preferred podcast platform. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and continue to grow. I want to thank Bob Berthasell for our theme music, our guest, Susanna Ashton, and co-host Mark Langston. And we thank you for being a part of our community of curious minds. St. Louis in Tune is a production of Motif Media Group and the U.S. Radio Network. Remember to keep seeking, keep learning. Walk worthy and let your light shine. For St. Louis in Tune, I'm Arnold Stricker.